There is a particular kind of silence that exists only a feat of violence has passed through a place, and decided, for the moment, to move on. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of safety. It is the silence of a held breath, the pause between one heartbeat and the next, when an entire landscape waits to find out what it is now. The mud walls still stand, the dust still settles in long slow curtains through the afternoon light. The dogs that went quiet an hour ago have not yet found their voices again. And somewhere, in a compound that smells of dry straw, and gun oil and something older than both, 4 men are already preparing to leave. They have done what they came to do. They will not say much about it. They never do. This is a story about the arithmetic of force. Not the arithmetic of numbers, not the calculus of how many rifles or how many boots on how many square meters of contested ground. The other arithmetic. The kind that lives in the gap between mass and precision. The kind that asks not how many but how, and not what but who, and not whether a thing can be done, but whether the right kind of mind, applied at the right angle, can do what volume alone cannot. It is a story told across the dust-choked districts of Helmand Province in the long grinding years of a war that the world watched and did not fully understand. And it is a story that a generation of American officers still carry with them, quietly, the way one carries a lesson that costs something to learn. The village could not be entered. That was the fact of it, not by one company, not by 2. The ground was known, the coordinates were plotted, the intelligence reports had been read, and reread in the orange glow of computer screens inside forward operating bases that smelled of instant coffee and diesel exhaust. The village was there, 7 kilometers from the nearest coalition position, nested in a bend of the green zone where the Helmand River's water table turned the desert into something lush and dangerous and full of shadows, not in the way a position is held in a conventional war. No wire, no trenches, no artillery, held the way water holds a crack in stone. Invisibly, completely, with a patience that does not tire. The Taliban fighters who controlled that village had had years to learn its geometry. They knew which walls gave the best angles. They knew which alleyways funneled attackers into kill zones. They knew the pattern of how coalition forces moved, because coalition forces always moved the same way, because doctrine, training, and the sheer organizational mass of a modern military create patterns as inevitably as a river creates a channel. And then, one morning, 4 men arrived. They did not arrive the way a company arrives. No vehicles, no visible formation. They did not move the way doctrine said movement should look. What happened next in the hours that followed became one of those stories that circulates among senior officers in quiet rooms, told not as a boast, but as a question, as a long, careful meditation on what force actually is and what it isn't, and what the difference costs. If these long, quiet journeys into the margins of war, into the forgotten texture of decisions made in dust and silence far from the cameras and the briefing rooms, if they help you slow down, step back, and rest somewhere that takes the time to understand rather than simply inform, then stay with me. When you subscribe, you are not just supporting a channel, you are helping keep this kind of storytelling alive, the kind that moves slowly because the subject deserves slowness, the kind that believes the hours are worth it. Settle in. This is the story of 4 men, a village in Helmand, and what it revealed about the nature of warfare that no doctrine has yet found the language to fully describe. Helmand Province, southern Afghanistan. The arithmetic of this place has always been brutal, and it has always been old, long before there was a Taliban, long before there was an Afghanistan in the modern sense of the word. Helmand was a province defined by its extremes. In summer, temperatures climb past 45 degrees Celsius in the shade, a number that does not convey what it means to stand in it, to breathe air that tastes like the inside of an oven, to feel the moisture drawn from the body at a rate that the biology of temperate climate soldiers is simply not designed to compensate for. In winter, The same ground that baked in summer freezes at night with a cruelty that the thin-walled compounds do not adequately resist. The Helmand River cuts through this landscape like a wound, and along its banks in the strip of green that the Afghans call the Green Zone, a different world exists entirely. Trees, crops, irrigation ditches filled with slow brown water, mud-walled compounds so dense and so thick that satellite imagery resolved them as grey masses, their interiors invisible, their layouts knowable only to the people who had lived in them for generations. This strip of green running north to south through one of the most contested provinces in the most contested country in the world was where the war lived. The British, who took over Helmand from American forces in 2006, walked into a situation that their initial projections had dramatically underestimated. The original estimate, delivered with the kind of calm institutional confidence that exists only before contact with reality, was that the deployment would proceed with minimal fighting, that there might be no fighting at all, that reconstruction would be the primary mission. The general who made that assessment later called it the worst prediction of his career. By the summer of 2006, British troops were engaged in some of the most intense sustained combat that the British Army had experienced since the Korean War. Platoon houses in towns like Sangin and Musa Kuala and Nowzad were surrounded and besieged for weeks, resupplied by helicopter, because the roads were entirely controlled by fighters who seemed to materialize from the earth itself and dissolve back into it with equal ease. The mathematics were stark and they were not in the coalition's favour. Helmand Province covers approximately 58,584 square kilometres. In 2006, the British deployment to cover that area consisted of approximately 3,300 troops, a number that, when spread across the actual terrain, the actual villages, the actual kilometres of river valley and desert track and irrigated farmland, dissolved into almost nothing. 3,300 soldiers for 58,000 square kilometres. The arithmetic of coverage produced a figure of roughly 1 soldier per 17.5 square kilometres, and that figure said nothing about the valleys they could not see into, the villages they could not enter, the mountains that the fighters moved through with an ease born of lifetimes, lived in that altitude and that cold. The Taliban who operated in Helmand, and the term Taliban by this point in the war, had become a broad label that covered a range of actors united more by opposition to the foreign presence than by any singular ideology. These fighters had advantages that were not always legible in the intelligence reports. They had time. They had the patience of people who understood that the foreigners would eventually leave, because foreigners always eventually leave, and that the mathematics of presence and will and duration were on their side in ways that no amount of firepower could fully negate. They had knowledge of terrain that was literally generational, knowledge of the drainage ditches and the hidden paths and the compounds with 2 exits and one, and the walls that could absorb a bullet and the walls that could not. They had the support, whether willing or coerced, of populations who had learned that to be seen helping coalition forces was to invite consequences afitter the coalition forces moved on. And they had asymmetry, the beautiful, terrible equalizing arithmetic of asymmetry. A conventional military force is a visible thing. It is visible because it must be visible, because the command and control structures, the logistics chains, the medical evacuation procedures, the rules of engagement, the communication requirements, the sheer weight of equipment that keeps a modern soldier effective in the field, all of these create a signature, a detectable pattern, a rhythm that a patient observer watching from a compound roof or a hillside or behind a wall of dried mud can learn. The Taliban fighters in Helmand were patient observers. They had been watching for years before the British arrived, and they watched with the particular attention of people for whom watching was not a professional obligation but a survival skill, honed across generations of wars with foreigners. This is the environment into which the village question arrived, not as a strategic crisis, not as a headline, as a quiet operational problem in a sea of quiet operational problems, a cluster of compounds 7 kilometers from the nearest coalition position, that a company of soldiers from the nearest coalition position, that a company of soldiers from the nearest coalition position, that a company of soldiers from the nearest coalition position, that a company of soldiers from the nearest coalition position, that a company of soldiers, supported by air assets and artillery, could not enter without suffering casualties that the operational calculus deemed unacceptable. The approaches were covered, the alleyways were channeled. The fighting positions inside the compound walls had been prepared with the care of people who intended to use them many times. The village was not heavily fortified in any technical sense. It was perfectly adapted to its purpose, the way an organism is adapted to its niche, not through design, but through accumulated, layered trial and error knowledge of how to survive in a specific environment against a specific kind of threat. The company had tried. That is the part of the story that matters most, because it is the part that is most featen glossed over in the telling. The company had not simply shrugged and decided it was someone else's problem. They had conducted reconnaissance. They had studied the approaches. They had developed courses of action and wargamed them against what they knew of the enemy's dispositions. And each approach produced the same analytical conclusion: the cost of forcing entry under the current conditions against an enemy that held the geometric advantage inside a terrain feature it had shaped over years was a cost they could not justify, not because the men were unwilling, but because their commanding officer, doing the mathematics that commanding officers do at 2 in the morning with a red lens flashlight and a topographic map, kept arriving at the same answer. The numbers did not work. The geometry did not work. Mass and will and firepower alone were not sufficient. What was sufficient arrived on a morning that the officer who later told this story described only as grey, the kind of grey that Helmand produces in the hours before a dust storm, when the light flattens and the shadows disappear and the whole landscape seems to hold itself at a remove from colour and distinction. 4 men, arriving in a way that he declined to describe in detail. With equipment he also declined to inventory, moving with a quality of unhurried purpose that he said was the first thing that struck him. Not speed, but the specific absence of the hesitations and corrections and reorientations that normal soldiers make when moving through terrain they do not own. He watched them go, 4 men, into a village that a company could not enter, and then he waited. The history of the Special Air Service in Afghanistan is, in many ways, the history of a force discovering that the world it had been built for was gone, and building itself again in real time to fit the world that actually existed. The SAS was founded in 1941 by David Sterling, a man whose ideas about warfare were so far outside the orthodox thinking of the North African campaign that he had to bypass the conventional chain of command entirely to get them heard. Sterling's insight was not original. Small raiding parties had existed in warfare since warfare existed, but his articulation of it was radical in the context of his time. The idea, stated simply, was that a small group of highly trained, self-sufficient soldiers, operating at night, targeting not men but the systems and infrastructure that sustained military power, airfields, fuel dumps, communication lines, supply convoys, could achieve effects entirely out of proportion to their numbers. That the arithmetic of a small unit raid conducted with surprise and precision was not 100 men plus rifles plus planning equals one result, but something else entirely, something that conventional military mathematics could not easily express. The early operations bore him out. In the Western Desert, SAS raids against Axis airfields destroyed more aircraft than any number of air-to-air engagements could have managed. The mathematics was staggering. A small team, moving on foot or in stripped-down jeeps across terrain the enemy considered impassable, could in a single night render an airfield inoperative, The cost to the raiding party was minimal. The cost to the adversary was enormous. The ratio of effect to resource expenditure was so favorable that it bordered on the impossible, and it was possible only because the raid traded mass for precision, traded the certainty of overwhelming force for the uncertainty of perfect execution, and found that perfect execution, in the right hands, was the more reliable currency. But the Desert War was 50 years before Afghanistan, and the distance between those two theatres is not merely geographical. By the time the British government committed forces to the campaign in Afghanistan, the SAS had passed through decades of evolution that had taken it from raiding to counter-terrorism to hostage rescue to direct action to something that resisted easy categorization. A force capable of operating across a spectrum that ran from the most delicate intelligence-gathering reconnaissance to the most violent direct action, and that had learned to move between those modes fluidly, sometimes within the same operation. In Helmand, in the years of the most intense fighting, from 2006 through roughly 2012, when the coalition's focus began to shift toward transition and drawdown, the SAS operated as part of a broader Special Operations Task Force, alongside the SBS, the Australian SASRCR, and American counterparts. They operated at what the military calls the high end, the most sensitive targets, the most complex environments, the operations that required the kind of judgment that could not be entirely reduced to doctrine because doctrine was too slow, too blunt, and too loud for what the situation required. They moved at night, mostly. They moved in small numbers. They targeted the networks, the commanders, the facilitators, the bomb makers whose signatures had been built up patiently across months of intelligence work, with a precision that conventional forces operating under different rules and different constraints could not replicate. The village in the story is not named in any of the accounts, and that absence is deliberate. The discretion is the point. What happened there lives in the margins of the official record, in the AFITA action reports filed under classifications that may not be life-fitted for decades, and in the memory of the American officer who watched 4 men walk into a problem that 120 had been unable to solve, and waited and eventually, in a time frame he also declined to specify precisely, saw them walk back out. What those 4 men did in that village is not fully knowable from the outside. What is knowable is the methodology, the approach, the philosophy, the accumulated doctrine of small unit special operations that had been refined across the SAS's history and applied iteration by iteration to the specific conditions of southern Afghanistan. The village, from the outside, presented a set of geometric problems. Every approach was covered. Every angle of entry exposed a moving person to observation and fire from prepared positions that the defenders had months to select and improve. The channels of movement, the alleyways between compound walls, the gaps in the irrigation ditches, the paths through the vegetation, had been studied by the company and found wanting. Each one led somewhere the defender wanted the attacker to go. This is the fundamental problem of clearance operations in the Afghanistan Green Zone, and it is a problem that mass cannot solve. More soldiers moving down a covered alley do not improve the odds of the first soldier moving down that alley. They improve the certainty of consequence. They create a longer target list for the defender with good angles, and they do not address the core problem, which is the angles themselves. What small unit special operations can do, what they have practiced thousands of times in training and hundreds of times in execution, is refuse the geometry that the defender has prepared. Not by finding a different route through the same problem, but by changing the problem, by operating at a pace and level of initiative that disrupts the defender's decision cycle faster than the defender can adapt, by using the very darkness and confusion that make clearance operations dangerous for conventional forces as an operating environment that a team accustomed to working in it can navigate and exploit. By making the mathematics of a defended position work against the defender, not the attacker, because a defended position assumes an attacker who approaches predictably, in numbers, along routes that make sense from a conventional planning perspective. 4 men who do not approach predictably are not 4 men at a disadvantage. They are 4 variables the defenders' mathematics did not account for. The dust and the heat and the particular quality of Helmand's silences have a texture that soldiers who served there carry in their bodies long after they leave. The physical reality of operating in that environment is not abstract. It is not background. It is the medium through which every decision, every movement, every moment of judgment must pass. And it shapes those moments in ways that cannot be fully conveyed by coordinates on a map or grid references in an operations order. Helmand in summer is a kind of violence all by itself. The heat does not arrive gradually. It arrives with the sun, and it compounds through the morning hours until, by earlier feet are known, it has become something that requires management, the way a tactical problem requires management, something to be planned around, anticipated, mitigated, never ignored. Men carrying the loads that soldiers in that environment carry, body armor, ammunition, water, communications equipment, medical kit, the specific tools of their specific mission, are burning calories and losing moisture at rates that are genuinely difficult to sustain. The arithmetic of human endurance in 45-degree heat with a 550-kilogram load is not forgiving. The body's chemistry is indifferent to the mission. The green zone adds another layer. The same vegetation that makes the river valley livable makes it opaque. Lines of sight collapse to meters. The mud walls of compounds, some of them a meter thick, absorb sound and deflect radar and create a maze of enclosed spaces in which movement is loud and observation is limited, and the person who knows the maze already holds an advantage over the person who is encountering it for the first time. The irrigation ditches, the jowie as the local term goes, cut across movement routes at angles that force channeling, that push soldiers onto specific paths, that create the kind of predictability that an intelligent defender learns to exploit. The flies, the smell of animal dung and wood smoke and diesel and something sweetly rotten that was omnipresent in the green zone compounds, and that no soldier who spent time there has been able to fully describe in terms that convey it to someone who wasn't there. The dogs, which in Afghan villages were not pets but working animals, large and aggressive, and alerted to the scent of strangers in ways that no noise discipline could entirely suppress. The children, who might be observers, the women visible through gaps in walls who might be signalling, the old men sitting in doorways who watched with the patience of people who had watched many armies come and many armies go, and who had learned across those watchings that the safest position was the one that committed to nothing. In this environment, 4 men carried a different relationship to the terrain than 120 men could carry, not because they were superhuman, not because training had made them impervious to the heat or the noise or the complexity, but because their unit of operation, 4 people, produces a signature so much smaller than a company that it occupies a different perceptual space in the defender's awareness, because they could move through gaps that a larger element could not use, because their communications burden was lighter, their coordination was tighter, their decision cycle was faster, because in an environment where every extra body is also an extra source of noise, of heat signature, of disturbance to the dogs and the birds and the surface patterns of the dust, 4 men are not just fewer soldiers than 120, they are a qualitatively different thing. The SAS training pipeline is one of the most demanding in the world, and the demand is not primarily physical, though the physical component, the infamous selection process in the Brecon Beacons, the long tab marches across the Black Mountains with increasingly heavy loads at increasingly demanding speeds, is severe enough that it eliminates the majority of candidates before the more complex assessments even begin. The physical requirement is a filter, not a goal. What it filters for is not strength or speed, but the specific quality of judgment under sustained deprivation and pressure that the operational environment will later demand. A man who can navigate a 50-kilometer route across winter mountains with a 40-kilogram Bergan, alone, in deteriorating weather, against a time standard that does not adjust for conditions, while making the correct decisions at each navigation point. That man is demonstrating something about his relationship to adversity that a fitness test or a classroom exercise cannot reveal. But selection is only the beginning. The training that follows, the continuation training, the specializations, the continuation exercises across increasingly realistic and increasingly demanding environments is where the specific competencies are built. Languages, demolitions, signals, combat medicine, the particular arts of close target reconnaissance, the techniques of hostage rescue and personnel recovery, the tradecraft of intelligence collection in denied environments, the judgment required to identify among a set of targets in a complex environment the one that will produce the effect that the mission requires, and to execute against that target with the minimum force necessary to achieve the mission. Because minimum force is not timidity, it is the arithmetic of sustainability, the recognition that every resource expended must be justified against its strategic return. The phrase, 4 men cleared a village a company couldn't enter, is the kind of statement that, stripped of its context, sounds like mythology, like the kind of story that gets told to justify budgets, or to sustain institutional prestige, or to perform a particular kind of masculine narrative about the special and the ordinary. It is the kind of statement that invites skepticism, and the skepticism is not unreasonable. Mythology serves organizational interests. Stories about exceptional small units can be used to distract from the systemic failures of large institutions. The history of special operations is littered with inflated legends and carefully managed narratives, but the skepticism in this case should not go all the way down to the experience itself, because the officer who told the story was not a man with an interest in special operations mythology. He was a conventional infantry officer, trained in the traditions and the doctrines of the United States Army, a man whose institutional formation had not predisposed him to reverence for units outside his own. He was, by his own description, initially annoyed by the implication that a problem his company could not solve was going to be handed off to 4 people. The annoyance was professional. It was the annoyance of a man who understood his own competence and his own soldiers' competence, and who did not find it comfortable to be told, implicitly, that something was beyond them. The thing that changed his mind was not being told about it a featward, it was watching it happen. The quality of movement, he said, that was the first thing. Not speed, not aggression, a kind of settled, unhurried intentionality that he struggled to find the right word for. The 4 men moved through the approaches to the village, the same approaches that the company's reconnaissance had identified, the same approaches that the planning process had assessed as untenable, and they moved through them in a way that looked, from a distance, almost leisurely, like men who knew exactly where they were going and had no uncertainty about the path. He used the phrase "at home" to describe it, meaning something specific by that, not physical ease, but perceptual ease, the ease of people operating well within their competence, in an environment they had prepared themselves to inhabit, in a situation that matched their training so closely that training and reality had become nearly indistinguishable. He lost sight of them when they entered the vegetation, and then, in the way that these things happen in the green zone, the village and its surroundings seemed to close over them, and he waited. The concept of the human network, the idea that what sustains an insurgency is not primarily a set of individuals, but a system of relationships, of supply, of financing, of communications, of local authority and local complicity, had become, by the mid-2000s, the organizing principle of the most sophisticated thinking about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. The phrase was General Stanley McChrystal's, or at least he articulated it most publicly. It takes a network to defeat a network. The Taliban were not an army in the field. They were a living system, adaptive and distributed, and capable of reconstituting a feature damage in the way that living systems reconstitute, not by replacing identical parts, but by routing around damage, by shifting functions, by growing new capacity where old capacity had been destroyed. Defeating this kind of system with conventional military force presents problems that are structural, not just tactical. A conventional military optimizes for attrition, for removing enemy combatants from the battlefield faster than they can be replaced. The attrition model works when the adversary's strength is finite, and when destroying a portion of it meaningfully degrades the remainder. Against a network that draws its strength from a population, and from a cause rather than from a fixed organizational chart, attrition alone does not produce strategic effects. You can kill the head of a cell and find that the head of a cell has been replaced within days by a man who was waiting for exactly this promotion. You can destroy a fighting position and find that the next week the position has been rebuilt by people who regard construction as less dangerous than confrontation, and who have been building these kinds of positions in this kind of terrain for their entire lives. The SAS approach to this problem, developed and refined over years of operations in Helmand and Kandahar and the other contested provinces of southern Afghanistan, was less about attrition and more about precision disruption, about identifying the nodes in a network that, when removed, would cause the network to collapse or reconfigure in ways that reduced its effectiveness, not permanently perhaps, but long enough for other processes to work, about building the intelligence picture patiently enough that operations were not just violent events, but interventions in a system, targeted and timed and calibrated, in ways that the system itself could not easily anticipate or absorb. The village in the story was a node, not just a geographic feature, a node in a network of supply, of authority, of intimidation, and support that sustained Taliban influence in a section of the green zone that had been, for the company responsible for it, effectively ungovernable. The men inside the village were not, primarily, fighters in the conventional sense. Some of them were, but the more important ones were facilitators, the man who managed the supply line, the man who ran the local shadow court, the man whose presence in that village made the village a center of gravity for the network rather than just a collection of mud walls and frightened families. The company had not been able to enter the village not only because of the tactical geometry, but because the rules of engagement, the proportionality requirements, the civilian presence, the risk of creating the kind of incident that would cost the coalition far more in strategic terms than any tactical gain was worth. All of these constraints, which were not weaknesses but deliberate choices about how to conduct a war in a way that had some hope of a sustainable political outcome, all of them converged to make the company's entry problem nearly intractable. 4 men operating under different parameters, with different intelligence, with the specific legal and operational framework that governs special operations in a context of this kind, could solve a version of the problem, but the company could not. The mathematics had not changed. What had changed was who was doing the arithmetic. Helmand's history with foreign soldiers runs longer than the NATO campaign, and longer than the Soviet campaign before it. It runs back through the British Indian Army's encounters with the same terrain and the same tribes in the 19th century. Encounters that produced among the Pashtun communities of the border regions a cultural memory of foreign military presence that was not primarily a memory of defeat, but of persistent, expensive resistance. The First Anglo-Afghan War, which began in 1839 and ended in the catastrophic British retreat from Kabul in 1842, killed approximately 16,000 soldiers and camp followers and produced in the British military psyche a wound so deep that it shaped Afghan policy for decades. The Second and Third Anglo-Afghan Wars added their own layers. The Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted from 1979 to 1989, cost the Soviet Union approximately 15,000 dead, more than 35,000 wounded, and a significant contribution to the political and economic crisis that eventually led to the dissolution of the USSR, a fact that was not lost on the Pashtun communities of Helmand, who had fought the Soviets with American-supplied weapons and had drawn from that experience a specific earned confidence in the proposition that the mathematics of time and will favored the defender, always, in this particular ground. This is not to say that the Taliban were the moral or political equivalents of the Mujahideen who fought the Soviets. History is more complicated than that, and the communities of Helmand had their own complicated relationship with the Taliban, who were, in many areas, neither welcome rulers nor simple freedom fighters, but a third kind of presence, coercive and ideologically rigid and effete and resented, who were nevertheless preferable in the local calculation to an open endorsement of foreign occupation that could result in immediate and severe consequences. The arithmetic of survival in Helmand was never simple. It was never clean. The families and the compound walls were not all one thing or another thing. They were people in the middle of a conflict they had not asked for, making calculations every day about how to remain alive, how to protect their children, how to navigate between armed groups with competing demands and competing threats, and how to endure until the enduring was over. The SAS operators who worked in this environment, who ran what the military calls human intelligence networks, who built relationships with local power brokers, who sat in the specific kind of patient silence that intelligence gathering in a complex human environment requires, understood this layering. They had to understand it, because operations conducted without it, operations that treated the population as a background rather than a system of relationships with its own logic and its own agency, produced results that the intelligence and operational community had learned, expensively, were counterproductive. Every family whose male relatives were detained without cause was a family whose remaining members were now available to the recruitment argument that the coalition was not a force of liberation but of occupation. Every civilian casualty, every compound door kicked in at 3 a.m. by soldiers who had the wrong compound, every interaction conducted with the specific kind of aggressive uncertainty that fear produces in young men with rifles, each of these was a data point in a calculation that the local population was making continuously, in real time, about where their interests actually lay. The best special operations in Helmand were conducted by men who understood this, who brought to it not just tactical skill, but a kind of social intelligence, an ability to read the human environment with the same precision that they read the physical terrain. Not because they were morally superior, but because they were effective, and effectiveness in counterinsurgency is inseparable from the quality of relationships with the population in which the insurgency is embedded. 4 men, in this context, carry a different relationship to the human environment than 120. 4 men can move through a village at night without the organizational footprint that marks a company-level operation as an event. 4 men can, in some circumstances, make contact with individuals inside a village before any guns are drawn, in ways that the presence of 100 soldiers would make impossible. 4 men can work the problem in a way that treats the population not as terrain, but as participants in the situation, as people with their own interests and their own assessments of how the situation is likely to evolve, who might, under the right conditions, make different choices than the choices they had been making. None of this is pacifism. None of it denies the reality that the 4 men went into the village with the capability and the willingness to apply lethal force if the situation required it, and that in some portion of the cases, some number of the operations that 4-man teams ran in Helmand's villages during the years of heaviest fighting, the situation did require it. Violence was not the failure mode of these operations. It was a tool in a toolkit, available and prepared, but not the only tool, and not always the primary one. The American officer did not have full visibility into what happened inside the village. He had the view from outside, the approach, the entry, the silence during, the departure of Feta. He had the specific quality of the debrief, if there was one, to which he was privy. He had the result, which was that the village, a Feta 4 men entered it, was no longer a problem in the same way it had been a problem, not permanently. Not in the sense that the underlying conditions that had made it contested in the first place had been resolved. They had not, and they would not be resolved by a single operation, however precise, however well executed. But in the specific operational sense, for the specific purpose that had made the village a concern, the mathematics had changed. How they changed is the part the story does not fully illuminate and should not fully illuminate, because the illumination would serve purposes that the operational security context does not support, and that the privacy of the people involved does not warrant. What the story illuminates, what it has been illuminating every time it has been told, in quiet conversations in officers' messes and planning rooms and the kind of semi-informal professional discussions that shape military thinking in the spaces between official doctrine, is the question at its center: what is force? What is it actually? Is it the number of soldiers or the quality of action? Is it the weight of firepower or the precision of application? Is it the organizational capacity to sustain violence over time, or the specific irreproducible human capacity to make the right decision in the right moment in the dark, with incomplete information and no guarantee of outcome? The British military tradition that produced the SAS has its own complicated answers to these questions, and the answers are not always comfortable for the institution that produced the unit. The SAS exists partly as an acknowledgement that the conventional military, for all its organizational genius, for all the accumulated wisdom of its doctrine and its training systems, cannot do everything, that there are geometric configurations of terrain and enemy and population and political constraint that require a different kind of solution, a solution that cannot be scaled up from conventional forces no matter how much will and firepower is applied, but that can be derived from a small group of people who have been prepared in very specific ways for exactly this kind of problem. This acknowledgement has never been comfortable. The institutional history of the SAS is a history of arguments with the conventional army about resources, about autonomy, about the operational space within which special forces should be permitted to work. It is a history of tensions between the need for control, the legitimate organizational need to ensure that highly capable lethal actors are operating within appropriate legal and political frameworks, and the operational need for independence, the equally legitimate military need to allow the small group with the right skills and the right intelligence to operate without the delays and the constraints that conventional command structures inevitably impose. These tensions were not resolved in Afghanistan. They were managed imperfectly, as they have always been managed, through the accumulation of trust and precedent, and the slow institutional learning that eventually produces something close to a workable relationship between special and conventional forces. In Helmand, in the years when the fighting was at its worst, that relationship was closer and more functional than it had been in earlier conflicts, partly because the operational environment made it necessary. Conventional forces needed things that special forces could provide: intelligence, access, precision effects in situations where conventional force would be counterproductive. Special forces needed things that conventional forces could provide: logistics support, quick reaction forces for emergency extraction, aviation assets, the organizational infrastructure that even the most self-sufficient small unit eventually requires. The boundaries between them, in Helmand, became more permeable than doctrine had traditionally described, and the permeability was productive. The American officer's company was part of that relationship. His company provided support, the kind that does not make the stories, but without which the stories could not happen. The quick reaction force that sat at readiness in case 4 men needed extraction under fire. The aviation that held on station, circling in the grey morning air, ready to provide the kind of support that would rebalance the mathematics if the mathematics turned bad, the logistics that had pre-positioned equipment at a location that 4 men could reach if their situation required resupply, the intelligence machinery that had built the picture of the village over months of patient collection and analysis, the human intelligence, the signals intelligence, the aerial surveillance, the pattern of life analysis that told the planners not just where the targets were, but when they were where, and who else was with them, and what the effects on the surrounding population of various courses of action were likely to be. None of this is visible in the story as it is usually told. The story is about 4 men and a village, because that is the resolution at which the event is emotionally legible. 4 people doing something 120 could not do, the arithmetic of skill over mass, the triumph of precision over volume. But the story is also about everything that made those 4 men possible. The training pipeline that selected and shaped them over years, the intelligence networks that built the picture they operated against, the conventional forces that provided the infrastructure of support within which their independence existed, the political and legal frameworks that defined the space within which their operations were authorized, and the long institutional history of a military organization that had, across 8 decades of argument and adaptation, figured out how to train this specific kind of soldier for this specific kind of problem. The village did not stay cleared in any permanent sense. Nothing in Helmand stayed any particular way permanently. The green zone's ecology of conflict, the constant pressure of population need and economic desperation and ideological commitment and tribal obligation that fed the insurgency's capacity to reconstitute, did not stop because a small unit operation had removed or disrupted a particular set of actors in a particular compound. The network adapted. It always adapted. The mathematics of the insurgency's sustainability were not solved by any single operation or any series of operations, no matter how precisely targeted or effectively executed. What changed and what the officer's account is really about is something more modest and more important than a decisive tactical victory. What changed is his understanding of what military force is and what it can do and what it cannot do and where the line between those things lies. He went into that morning with one understanding of the problem, a conventional understanding, grounded in the doctrine and training and institutional culture that had made him a competent infantry officer. And he came out of it with a different understanding, not a conversion to the view that special forces are always the answer, but a genuine expansion of the map, a recognition that the problem space of warfare is larger than any single institutional tradition can encompass, and that the question of what works in any given situation requires a kind of intellectual humility that military institutions, with their investment in their own doctrines and their own identities, do not always find easy. He has told this story in professional military education settings, in the context of discussions about operational design and the relationship between conventional and special operations. He tells it not as a boast, not as a claim about the superiority of any particular unit or any particular nation's military, but as a question, as a prompt for the kind of reflection that the best professional military education tries to produce in officers who will one day face problems for which no existing doctrine provides a complete answer. The question is, what is force? And the answer the story implies, without stating because the story knows better than to state it, is that force is not a fixed quantity. It is a relationship between capability and situation, between the specific tools available and the specific problem to be solved, between the mathematics of the situation as the adversary has configured it, and the capacity of the attacker to change the mathematics rather than simply apply more of the same mathematics that the adversary has already accounted for. 4 men in a Helmand village are not more force than 100, and 20 men in the same space, in any conventional meaning of the word force. But they are a different kind of force. They produce a different kind of problem for the adversary. They change the geometry, and in a war where the geometry was everything, where the patient accumulated geometric advantage of fighters who had spent years shaping their environment for exactly this kind of conflict, was the primary obstacle to every conventional operational solution. The capacity to change the geometry was not a special capability. It was the capability. Everything else was preparation. It is 2024, and the British have been gone from Helmand for more than a decade. The Americans are gone too, a feat of the withdrawal of 2021 that ended 20 years of coalition presence in Afghanistan, and that produced, in the months and years that followed, a set of outcomes that no one who had spent time in Helmand in the years of heaviest fighting found easy to look at directly. The Taliban control the country again. They have since August of 21, when their forces entered Kabul so quickly that the pace of their advance outran the intelligence assessments that had predicted it would take them months. The speed was its own kind of arithmetic, the arithmetic of an organization that had spent 20 years waiting, that had maintained its coherence and its command structures and its patience through 2 decades of pressure, that had watched the foreigners argue about their timelines and their strategies and their definitions of success, and had concluded correctly that waiting was the most effective strategy available to a force whose fundamental assets were time and will, and the support of enough of the population to sustain its operations through whatever the foreigners could bring against it. Helmand is Taliban country again, as it was before the intervention began. The green zone along the river is still there. The compounds are still there, some of them rebuilt, some of them still carrying the physical marks of the years of fighting. The blast patterns in the mud walls, the collapsed sections, the occasional cleared field where a compound used to be. The people who lived in those compounds, some of them, are still there. Some are not. Some are in refugee camps in Pakistan or Iran. Some are in European countries where they arrived defeated journeys that took months and cost everything they had. Some are in graves in the desert, or in the river, or in places that no longer exist in any legible form. The British soldiers who served in Helmand, the conventional infantry who held the platoon houses in Sangin, and Musa Kuala, who walked the patrol routes in the Green Zone, who drove the vehicles on the roads that the IEDs made into a mathematics of lethal probability. These men and women came home with a Helmand that did not leave them. The visible wounds, for those who carry them, are legible enough. The invisible ones, the specific shape of a particular kind of trauma that comes from years of hypervigilance in an environment that genuinely was trying to kill you, followed by an abrupt return to a world where that vigilance was no longer appropriate, but could not simply be switched off. These are harder to quantify. The mental health statistics for Helmand veterans are data points that the institution is still learning to process. The arithmetic of cost, in the human sense, is not complete. It may never be complete. The SAS operators who worked in Helmand, and worked is the word, with all the weight that word carries, the weight of repetitive labour in dangerous conditions over extended periods, the operational tempo that in the years of peak activity meant missions at a rate that no other force was sustaining. These men came home with their own version of that weight. The SAS does not talk publicly about its own losses. The families of operators killed in Afghanistan received the news through a specific kind of official communication that was careful not to say where or how, and their grief was conducted without the public acknowledgement that the deaths of conventional soldiers announced in the Houses of Parliament and the American Congressional Record received. This discretion is not callousness. It is a choice made by the institution and by the families and by the operators themselves before they were ever operators about the relationship between their service and their visibility. But it means that the cost of what the SAS did in Helmand exists in large part in the same private space that the operations themselves occupied, known to those who experienced it, not fully legible to those who did not. The village from the story is still there. It is somewhere in Helmand, in the green zone with mud walls and flat roofs, and the particular quality of light that falls on the river valley in the later Feta known when the dust is up and the sun is angled low. The people who live in it now are navigating whatever the current reality of Taliban governance in that district requires of them. They are calculating, as they have always calculated, how to survive in the specific conditions that exist today, knowing that conditions change and that the only constant in the arithmetic of life in Helmand is that the arithmetic is always changing. What happened inside those walls on that grey morning, whatever the four men found, whatever decisions they made, whatever the result was in its full, unredacted operational specificity, has been filed in the appropriate places and classified at the appropriate level, and will not be fully known to the public for some years, if ever. The American officer who watched it happen has carried it for years, not as a burden but as a piece of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that changes how you see a problem, that sits behind your assessments and your recommendations and your professional judgments in ways you cannot always articulate, but that nonetheless shape the way you think. He is not the only one. There is a generation of conventional military officers who served alongside special forces in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places that do not appear in the public record, who came away from those experiences with a similar kind of knowledge. Not reverence exactly. The good ones do not come away with reverence because reverence is a form of category error, a way of making the exceptional into the supernatural and thereby exempting yourself from the work of understanding it. But respect, grounded in direct observation of what a small group of highly prepared people can do in a specific environment that they have been built for, and curiosity about what that implies for the way you think about force and problem solving and the relationship between mass and precision in the mathematics of conflict. The lesson is not that special forces are always the answer. The lesson is more uncomfortable than that. The lesson is that there is no always, that every military problem exists in a specific context with specific parameters and specific constraints, and that the solution to any specific problem requires a willingness to match the capability to the problem, rather than the problem to the capability you have most of, that the institutional tendency to reach for the tool you have most confidence in, because it is familiar, because it is yours, because it represents your institutional identity and your professional formation, is a tendency that the best military thinking resists, because the problem space of warfare does not respect institutional boundaries or professional preferences. 4 men cleared a village a company couldn't enter. The reasons they could are not mysterious. They are not magical. They are the product of specific training, specific selection, specific institutional investment in a specific kind of human capability over a long period of time. They are the product of specific intelligence that was built patiently and expensively by a support structure that never gets mentioned in the story. They are the product of specific operational conditions, the right mission, the right people, the right moment, the specific alignment of factors that makes precision possible when volume would not be. The reasons the company couldn't are not a failure. They are not a commentary on the courage or the competence of the soldiers who tried, and who did the mathematics and concluded that the cost was not justified. They are the product of a different set of constraints, operational, legal, political, organizational, that governed a different kind of force in a different relationship to the environment. The company did not fail. The company encountered a problem that their tools were not the right tools for, and they recognized it. That recognition is its own kind of competence. The gap between those two things, between what the company could do and what 4 men could do, is not a gap that should make us comfortable. It is a gap that deserves sustained attention, because in that gap lives a set of questions that no doctrine has fully answered, and that the history of modern warfare has posed with increasing insistence. What is the correct relationship between mass and precision in military force? What is the correct institutional framework for developing and deploying both? and what is the correct understanding of what the problem actually is before we decide which tools to bring to it. The village is quiet now. It was always, in some sense, quiet. The quiet of a place that holds its own council, that has seen more soldiers of more nations come and go than any of those soldiers could fully reckon with, and that continues in its own time and its own logic regardless of what the soldiers decide about it. The mud walls do not remember. The irrigation ditches carry the same water they always carried. The dogs have found their voices again, and somewhere very far from that village a former officer sits in a room and thinks occasionally about a grey morning in Helmand and 4 men walking into a problem that 120 could not solve, and about what that tells him, still, after all these years, about the mathematics of what force actually is. The answer has never been simple. It was not simple that morning in the green zone, with the dust in the air and the silence where there should have been sound. It was not simple in the decades of institutional argument that produced the SAS and the doctrine of special operations that it refined. It is not simple now, in the classrooms and the planning rooms where the lessons of Afghanistan are being processed by people who will face their own versions of the problem in their own grey mornings in their own places, whose names have not yet become familiar. What is simple, what the story reduces to, at its core, is the observation that the mathematics change when the variables change, that the arithmetic of a defended position is not fixed, that the geometry of a problem is not permanent, that 4 is not always less than 120. The rest is preparation, and preparation, in the end, is the only arithmetic that matters. To understand what 4 men did in that village, it helps to understand what a 4-man patrol actually is, not as an organizational unit, not as a doctrinal construct, but as a lived reality, as the specific and unusual thing that it is to operate as 1/4 of a team, so small that every person in it is simultaneously a specialist and a generalist, a leader and a follower, a source of capability and a potential point of failure whose loss would halve the team's strength, in a way that losing 1 man from a 100-man company never could. The 4-man patrol is the foundational unit of SAS operations, and it has been since the regiment's earliest days. Sterling chose 4 deliberately, not 2, because 2 is too fragile, too easily disrupted, too limited in its ability to provide mutual support in the chaos of a contact or a compromise. Not 6 or 8, because 6 or 8 begin to generate the organizational noise that 4 avoids, the additional coordination burden, the larger acoustic and visual signature, the greater logistical footprint. 4 is the number that sits precisely at the inflection point, enough to provide mutual support in almost any tactical situation, small enough to move through environments where larger groups cannot pass unnoticed. Within a standard 4-man patrol, the SAS distributes responsibilities in a way that ensures no single capability is lost if any single person is lost. The medic is not just a medic, he is also a demolitions operator, a signals operator, a linguist in whatever language the operational theatre requires, a soldier, capable of taking point or bringing up the rear depending on the situation, the signals operator who maintains the communications architecture that connects the team to its support structure is also a combatant capable of standing a watch in a hide site for 24 hours, without movement, without sound, cataloguing everything that passes through the observed area with a patience that most humans find physically impossible to sustain. This cross-training is not an administrative convenience. It is the structural answer to the mathematical problem of fragility. A team of 4 that relies on any single member for any single critical function becomes, when that member is incapacitated, a team of 3 that cannot perform that function. A team of 4 in which every member can perform every critical function with varying degrees of expertise remains, even under loss, a functional team capable of completing the mission and returning to safety. The redundancy is the capability. The SAS selection process, which takes place primarily in the Brecon Beacons of South Wales and secondarily in the jungle of Belize, is designed to identify the specific human substrate from which this cross-competent, multiply-redundant team can be built. The famous endurance phase, the weeks of individual navigation exercises across the Black Mountains and the Brecon Beacons, with loads increasing in weight and distances increasing in length and time standards that do not adjust for weather, is not, as is sometimes assumed, a physical test. The physical requirements are high enough that many candidates who are genuinely fit, genuinely trained, and genuinely motivated fail on physical grounds. But the deeper purpose of the endurance phase is psychological. It is designed to place candidates in conditions of sustained physical and cognitive degradation, cold, wet, exhausted, navigating alone in darkness across terrain that the Welsh weather can make genuinely hostile, and to observe, under those conditions, which candidates maintain the quality of judgment and the consistency of decision-making that the operational role requires. A man who navigates well when he is warm and rested and has slept 8 hours is demonstrating nothing that the SAS needs to know. A man who navigates well on the 4th day of a continuous exercise, having slept perhaps 6 hours in that entire period, carrying a load that has increased to 55 kilograms, with feet in a state that most people would consider a medical emergency, invisibility reduced by rain to 30 meters, that man is demonstrating something. He is demonstrating that the part of his cognition that maintains spatial awareness and decision-making discipline under pressure is more robust than the part that registers physical distress and translates it into a call to stop. That the executive function is not merely available under duress, but accessible under conditions that most humans would describe as beyond the point of rational management. This is the raw material. What training then does with it over the months and years of continuation training, special to arm courses and operational experience, is to build on top of that substrate a set of specific capabilities: languages, medical skills, demolitions knowledge, signals expertise, the specific arts of close reconnaissance and direct action, and to develop, within the small team, the kind of trust and mutual knowledge that converts individual capability into collective effectiveness. A 4-man SAS patrol in Helmand was not 4 individuals who happened to be in the same place. It was a unit that had trained together, deployed together, operated together in situations of genuine danger, and developed, through that shared experience, a quality of coordination that operates below the level of explicit communication. The veteran patrol leader watching his point man stop and raise a fist does not need the point man to say anything. He already knows from the way the point man's weight shifted in the moment before the fist went up, from the direction of the attention, from 100 previous moments in which the same physical vocabulary communicated the same class of information, exactly what the point man saw, and approximately where it is. The patrol's response to that information begins before the hand signal is complete. The interval between perception and collective response is so compressed in a patrol that has been together long enough that an observer watching from outside might mistake it for a single organism reacting to a single stimulus. This is not mystical. It is the product of time and repetition and the specific trust that comes from knowing that the 3 people around you will do exactly what needs to be done in the next 30 seconds without discussion, without hesitation, without the organizational friction that slows larger units. In Helmand's green zone, where the moment between detection and action was of Eton measured in fractions of a second, and where the compound geometry made communication across a patrol difficult and noisy, this compressed decision cycle was not an advantage. It was the difference between a functional patrol and a casualty. The green zone in Helmand Province is approximately 20 kilometers wide, at its widest point along the middle Helmand River, and it narrows significantly in the upper and lower reaches. The density of human habitation is remarkable by any measure. Hundreds of compounds per square kilometre in the most heavily settled areas, separated by irrigation channels, by the pathways that connect one compound to the next. by occasional open fields that in another context would look agricultural and productive, and in this context looked like the open ground that they were, exposed to observation from the compound walls on every side, crossable only at risk and only by acceptance of the fact that you were, for the seconds you spent crossing, visible to every observation post in line of sight. British forces, in the years of heavy fighting in Helmand, learn the green zone the way you learn something that is trying to kill you, attentively, repeatedly, at cost. The young corporal, who had walked the same stretch of irrigation ditch 50 times, developed a knowledge of its geometry that no map and no satellite image conveyed, which stretch channeled movement into a killing ground, which culvert was deep enough to provide cover, which section of ditch wall had been used as a firing position, of eat enough that the soil on the far side showed the distinctive disturbance pattern of a rifle rested against it. This knowledge was not transferable through briefings. It was not in any field manual. It lived in the bodies of the men who had walked the ground repeatedly and survived doing so, and it was the most valuable kind of operational knowledge the force possessed. The SAS operated in Helmand's Green Zone with a relationship to the terrain that was built differently, but was in many ways as deep. Their knowledge was built through reconnaissance, through the specific patient collection of ground truth that direct observation and careful measurement produces, and through the intelligence products that allowed them to understand not just the physical terrain, but the human terrain. Who lived in which compound, who moved between which compounds, and when which compounds were used for storage, and which were used for meetings, and which were used for nothing more sinister than the daily lives of families trying to survive in a contested landscape. This human terrain knowledge, built patiently over months by intelligence specialists who compiled pattern-of-life analysis from surveillance feeds and human sources and signals exploitation, was the foundation on which the precision of their operations rested. Precision, in this context, does not mean only accuracy. It means the application of force at exactly the point in a system where the application of force will produce the desired effect, and not at other points. It means knowing before an operation begins what the operation is actually trying to achieve, not what it will destroy or disrupt, but what effect in the human system its successful execution will produce. It means choosing the course of action that produces that effect with the minimum of collateral disturbance to the surrounding environment, because collateral disturbance in a counterinsurgency environment is not just a moral consideration. It is a strategic cost that the mission analysis must account for as carefully as it accounts for the direct effects of the operation. The village in Helmand was not entered because of aggression, in either direction. The company that tried and concluded it was too costly was not being timid. The Taliban fighters who defended it were not being extraordinarily brave. Both were doing the same thing, applying arithmetic. The company's arithmetic said the cost of forcing entry under current conditions was higher than the operational calculus supported. The defenders' arithmetic said the geometry they had built, the prepared positions, the covered approaches, the channeled alleyways, was sufficient to make that cost prohibitive. Both calculations were correct as far as they went. What changed when 4 men entered the picture was not courage or aggression, it was the arithmetic. 4 men did not multiply the company's capabilities by some special factor. They changed the problem. They operated in a part of the solution space that was outside the envelope the defender's geometry had been designed to address. And within that part of the solution space, their specific capabilities, their small signature, their speed of action, their specific intelligence about the human terrain inside the village, were sufficient to produce an effect that the company's capabilities, however still, were not suited to produce. The mathematics came out differently. Autumn, Helmand Province. The year is one of the middle years of the war, 2009 perhaps, or 2010, when the surge of American forces was beginning to change the operational landscape in ways that were not yet fully legible to anyone trying to assess them from inside the campaign. The opium harvest is coming in from the fields along the river. The poppies that make Helmand one of the world's primary sources of heroin are also the economic foundation of most of the agricultural households in the province, and the Taliban's relationship with the opium economy is one of the underappreciated structural facts of the war, a source of financing and of political leverage over a population for whom the opium crop is a feat in the difference between subsistence and starvation, and for whom any force that threatens that crop is a force that threatens survival in the most literal possible sense. The harvest is a time of relative movement of feta, the relative stillness of the summer heat. Labourers move between compounds, trucks move on tracks that have been dry enough to use since the spring. The pattern of life in the green zone she-fits in ways that the intelligence analysts who study it know to mark and to assess, not because the harvest explains everything, but because understanding the rhythmic cycles of the human terrain is part of understanding where the anomalies are. And anomalies are where the useful information hides, in a forward operating base somewhere in the province, a collection of HESCO barriers and shipping containers and canvas structures that together constitute the remarkable improvised permanence of a modern military installation. A targeting meeting is concluding. The targeting process in Afghanistan, in the years of peak operational tempo, was a sophisticated and extensively documented procedure that tried to convert intelligence about individuals and networks into operational decisions, with clear lines of accountability. It involved intelligence analysts and legal advisors and targeting officers and commanding officers and, in the highest profile cases, political oversight that extended back to London and Washington. It was designed to be thorough, to be calibrated, to be the opposite of impulsive, and it was, at its best, exactly those things. A genuine attempt to impose rational deliberation on the selection of lethal action in a complex and ambiguous environment. At its best, not always, the targeting process operated under constraints of time, an intelligence quality and institutional pressure that sometimes produced decisions that subsequent investigation showed to have been based on incomplete or incorrect information. The history of the Afghan campaign includes a painful record of incidents in which the targeting process produced the wrong answer, in which the pattern of life analysis misidentified a civilian gathering as a militant meeting, in which the signal's intelligence conflated the phone of a wanted commander with the person currently carrying that phone, in which the pressure to produce results at the pace the operational tempo demanded compressed the deliberation that the process was designed to protect. These failures were real, and they were costly, not just in the immediate humanitarian sense, but in the strategic sense. Every wrong call was a data point in the local population's assessment of whether the coalition was something they could support or something they needed to protect themselves from. The best targeting decisions were the ones that took the time they needed to take, that demanded the level of corroboration that the consequences of being wrong required, and that produced operations that were not just kinetically successful, but strategically sound. That removed from the network exactly what the intelligence said they would remove, and left the surrounding human terrain no more disturbed than was necessary to achieve that removal. 4 men executing a well-targeted operation in a well-understood environment against a well-characterized set of objectives is the best case, the case where the investment in patience and precision pays its maximum dividend. It is not the universal case. The history of special operations in Afghanistan includes its own record of operations that went wrong, of intelligence failures and execution failures, and the specific terrible failures that happen when a force built for a particular kind of problem encounters, in the fog of execution, a version of the problem that differs from the version the planning process addressed. These failures do not negate the capability. They define its limits. They mark the boundaries of what precision can do and where the irreducible uncertainty of human conflict reasserts itself, regardless of how carefully the approach has been prepared. It is important to hold both of these things simultaneously. The story of 4 men clearing a village a company couldn't enter is a real story. It describes something that happened in a way that was consistent with the capabilities and the approach of the unit involved. It is not mythology, and it does not need to be treated as mythology to be remarkable. What it describes is genuinely remarkable, the product of an institution's sustained investment in a specific kind of human capability, applied at exactly the point in a situation where that capability produces its maximum effect, and the failures, the operations that produced the wrong effects, that cost more than they achieved, that added to the ledger of strategic costs that the coalition was accumulating throughout the campaign, are also real. They are also part of the story. They are the part that makes the story complete, that prevents it from becoming a mythology about the perfectibility of military force, that keeps it honest about what it actually describes. War is not perfectible. Conflict is not a problem that sufficiently careful preparation eliminates from the space of possible outcomes. The fog remains. The friction remains. The irreducible human fact that the adversary is also thinking, also adapting, also learning from the encounters that the coalition experiences as lessons and the adversary experiences as data. This fact remains, and it means that no capability, however refined, is permanent in its advantage. The moment a capability establishes its advantage, the adversary begins the process of adapting to it. The process of adaptation is slower in some adversaries than in others. The Taliban's adaptation to coalition special operations tactics over the course of the Afghan campaign was a real and documented process. The shy feat in communication practices, the adjustment of meeting patterns, the changes in how key figures moved and where they slept and which individuals they trusted, all of these reflected an adversary that was learning, as capable adversaries always learn, how to reduce the effectiveness of the tools being applied against it. This is the deepest arithmetic of counterinsurgency, and it is the one that the campaign in Afghanistan ultimately could not resolve, not because the individual operations were poorly conceived or poorly executed. Many of them were very well conceived and very well executed, but because individual operational success, however consistent and however precise, does not add up to strategic success if the strategic conditions that sustain the conflict are not addressed in parallel. The Taliban's capacity to regenerate was not primarily a function of their operational security or their tactical skill, though both of those were real. It was a function of the structural conditions, the weakness of the Afghan state, the corruption of its institutions, the economic desperation of the population, the sanctuary in Pakistan, the ideological and tribal networks that sustained the movement across generations that no number of precise operations could fully address. The 4 men who cleared the village were not tasked with addressing structural conditions, they were tasked with clearing the village. And they cleared it. Within the scope of their tasking, within the boundaries of what a 4-man patrol can be asked to achieve, they achieved what they were asked to achieve, and they achieved it in a way that a company could not. The lesson that draws from their operation, the lesson that the American officer carried away from that grey morning and has been sharing in professional military education settings ever since, is a lesson about capability, about the relationship between the tool and the problem, about the arithmetic of force in all its complexity. But there is another lesson, harder to hear and less effete and drawn, that the same morning contains. It is the lesson about what 4 men clearing a village actually changes in the larger equation, what it means in the accounting, whether the village, in the weeks and months, effete the operation, remained less contested, and if so, for how long, and at what cost to the continued operations required to maintain that status, whether the network that the village had been a node in reconfigured successfully, and whether the reconfigured network was more or less manageable than the original, whether the effect of the operation, precisely calibrated and precisely executed, translated into strategic progress or remained, as so many precise operations in that campaign remained, an island of local success in a sea of strategic stasis. These questions do not have clean answers. They are the questions that the officers and analysts who study the Afghan campaign at the strategic level have spent years working through, without arriving at conclusions that satisfy fully. The data is contested. The counterfactuals are unknowable. The argument about what the campaign actually achieved and whether it could have achieved more with different approaches and what different approaches might have looked like continues in the journals and the seminars and the private conversations of people who devoted years of their professional lives to it. What is not contested is the quality of the individual operations at their best. The professionalism, the precision, the specific competence of the men who executed them. That quality is real. It is the product of real institutional investment and real human commitment. It deserves the acknowledgement it receives in the quiet professional conversations where it circulates and in the broader public conversation about what military capability actually is and how it actually works. And what is also not contested, what the passage of time and the finality of the Taliban's return to power has made undeniable, is that the quality of individual operations, however high, is not a substitute for strategic coherence. That precision at the tactical level does not solve problems at the strategic level. That the 4 men who cleared the village and the hundreds of other small unit operations that preceded and followed that clearing were elements of a campaign that, in its ultimate strategic accounting, did not achieve the objectives that justified it. This is not a verdict on the men. It is not a commentary on their skill or their commitment or the legitimacy of the cost they bore. It is a reckoning with the limits of what military force, any military force at any level of sophistication, with any combination of conventional and special capabilities, can accomplish in the absence of the political conditions that would give the force's effects durability. Military operations create windows. Political processes must build through those windows. When the political processes are insufficient, when the state being defended cannot develop the capacity to govern legitimately, when the corruption corrodes the institutions faster than external support can strengthen them, when the political will in the intervening nations decays faster than the military campaign can produce durable results, the windows close, and the operations that opened them recede into history. The window that opened when 4 men cleared a village that a company could not enter closed again. It closed the way all windows in Helmand closed, with dust and time and the patient arithmetic of a conflict that had been there before the coalition arrived and would be there a feet at lee feet. The village exists in its own time now. The men who entered it exist in their own time now, carrying their own Helmand the way all who served there carry it, in the private accounting that does not appear in any strategic assessment. The question of what makes a soldier elite, genuinely, functionally elite in the sense that matters in an operational environment, is one that military institutions answer differently depending on the institutional needs of the moment. In periods of large-scale conventional war, the answer tends toward mass, toward training systems that can rapidly produce soldiers who perform consistently within well-defined roles. In periods of complex, ambiguous, low-intensity conflict, the answer tilts toward the individual, toward the specific human qualities that cannot be manufactured by a training pipeline, but can, at most, be identified and selected for and then developed through the accumulation of relevant experience. The SAS represents one answer to this question, developed across 8 decades of experience in exactly the kinds of conflicts where the individual answer matters most. But it is worth being clear about what the answer actually is, because the popular understanding of elite special operations forces tends toward mythology in ways that obscure rather than illuminate the actual source of their effectiveness. The SAS operator is not superhuman. He experiences cold and fear and fatigue with the same biology as everyone else. He makes mistakes, navigational errors, judgment calls under pressure that subsequent analysis shows were suboptimal, decisions in ambiguous situations that could have gone differently, and sometimes did go differently in ways that cost him or his teammates. He does not have access to certainty in uncertain situations. He operates in the same fog of war that every soldier operates in, with the same incomplete information and the same irreducible uncertainty about what the adversary is going to do next. What he has that distinguishes him from the typical soldier is a specific relationship to uncertainty. He has been trained, and more importantly, he has been selected for a tolerance of ambiguity and a quality of judgment under pressure that allows him to continue functioning effectively in conditions where most people's executive function degrades. He has been placed repeatedly in situations where the correct action was not obvious, where the consequences of the wrong action were severe, where the time available for decision was insufficient for certainty, and he has demonstrated repeatedly, consistently, the ability to make decisions in those conditions that produce acceptable outcomes. Not always the optimal outcome. Acceptable. Functional. The outcome that allows the mission to continue. This is the capability, not strength or speed or marksmanship or any of the individual physical and technical skills that training develops, though all of those matter, and all of them are present. The capability is the specific configuration of cognition and character that allows a man to remain a thinking, deciding, effective actor in conditions that are designed, whether by nature, by enemy action, or by the internal dynamics of a situation spiraling out of control, to prevent clear thinking and effective decision-making. In Helmand's green zone, this configuration was tested continuously, not in the dramatic moments, the moments of contact, the breaches, the entries into defended positions. Though it was tested there too, it was tested in the hours before those moments, in the hide sites where 4 men lay in absolute stillness for 18 hours, observing a compound, waiting for the information that would confirm the intelligence picture, and justify the operation or fail to confirm it and require a judgment call about whether to abort. In the periods of radio silence when communications were lost, and the team continued executing the mission with no ability to reach the support structure that was, in theory, available to them. In the moments when the situation on the ground had diverged sufficiently from the planned scenario that the mission parameters no longer clearly applied, and someone in the team had to decide without recourse to higher authority what the mission actually was now, these are the moments that the training is for, not the exciting ones. The exciting ones are, in a perverse way, the simpler ones, because the parameters are clearer and the required actions are more immediately obvious, and the body's stress response, channeled through enough repetition, becomes something closer to a performance enhancer than an impairment. The hard moments are the boring ones, the ambiguous ones, the ones where the right answer is genuinely unclear, and the cost of the wrong answer is genuinely high, and there is no deadline by which the ambiguity will resolve itself and clarity will arrive. A company commander managing 120 men has a different relationship to those moments than a 4-man patrol. Not better or worse, different. The company commander's decision-making is embedded in a command structure that provides support, oversight, and accountability. His decisions affect more people and are more visible, which creates pressures of its own kind. The 4-man patrol leader's decisions are embedded in a structure where the support is distant and the oversight is periodic, and the accountability, though ultimately rigorous, is immediate only to the 3 people around him. This is a different kind of pressure, and it selects for a different kind of decision-maker. The American officer understood this difference. In the way that observation makes things legible, that explanation does not. He had not been wrong to try to solve the village problem with his company. He had been right to try. His attempt was not a failure of courage or imagination. It was a correct assessment, made with the tools available to him, of a problem that his tools were not built for. The value of what he witnessed when the 4 men arrived was not the verdict that his approach had been wrong. It was the expansion of his understanding of what approaches exist, and more importantly, of what shapes a problem into one that requires one approach or another. The village is a case study now, in the private curriculum of the officers who carry it, not a lesson in the superiority of any particular force or any particular nation's military approach, a lesson in the geometry of problems, in the arithmetic of capability and situation, in the question that every military professional should be asking, always, before reaching for the tool they know best. Is this the right tool for this problem, or is this the problem that requires a different arithmetic? The answer is never permanent. The problem changes, the environment changes, the adversary changes. What was the right tool in one version of the problem may be the wrong tool in the next version. The capacity to recognize which version you are facing, to read the geometry with enough honesty to see it as it is rather than as your training and your institutional identity incline you to see it, is perhaps the rarest military skill of all, rarer than marksmanship, rarer than physical endurance, rarer than tactical creativity, and, in the long run, more important than any of them. There is a specific quality of light in Helmand in the hour before dawn. The darkness, which in the green zone is not the absolute darkness of open desert, but a layered, textured darkness full of shapes that are almost visible, almost resolved, almost comprehensible. This darkness begins to thin from the east in a way that is almost imperceptible at first, not a brightening exactly, more a reduction of the darkest dark. A gradual emergence of the nearest mud wall from the surrounding blackness, still grey, still featureless, but present in a way it was not a few minutes before. For soldiers who spent those hours on watch, or moving, or lying in the patient stillness of an observation post waiting for the light that would make legible what the darkness had concealed, this hour carries a specific emotional weight. It is the hour of maximum accumulated fatigue, the body's internal clock at its nadir. The hour when the sleep pressure is highest and the willpower required to resist it is most costly. It is the hour when operational tempo, if the timing has been correctly calculated, produces the advantage of surprise against a defender whose own fatigue has peaked. It is the hour when the grey world that emerges from darkness is briefly suspended between the certainty of night and the clarity of day, and in that suspension, things that were fixed and legible become momentarily fluid and negotiable. The four men, on whatever morning the story belongs to, moved through that hour. They moved in the way that they had learned to move in it, deliberately, economically, with the specific control of movement that hours of training in exactly this kind of darkness and exactly this kind of terrain had built into them at a level below conscious execution. They were not thinking about their footfalls. Their footfalls were thinking for themselves, in the sense that the accumulated repetitions of training had automated the low-level decisions of movement and left it the higher cognitive functions free for the decisions that could not be automated. They entered the village. What they encountered inside, the specific human geography of compounds and alleyways and sleeping families and prepared positions, and the men they were looking for, and whatever those men did in the moments when they realized what was happening. This is the interior of the story that the exterior does not contain. It is the part that is classified, that is protected, that belongs to the participants and not to the audience. What belongs to the audience is the before and the after, the company that tried and could not. The four men who walked in, the village that emerged on the other side of whatever happened, as a different kind of problem than it had been before. These are the facts that are available, and they are sufficient for the lesson the story teaches, and they are the limit of what should be asked of a story like this. 1. The lesson is not that small is always better. It is not that special forces are always the answer. It is not even, primarily, that precision beats mass, though that is part of it. The lesson is about the relationship between capability and problem, about the importance of seeing the problem clearly enough to know which tool fits it, and about the specific kind of institutional investment patient and expensive and never fully appreciated until the moment it is needed. That makes the right tool available when the problem arrives. Helmand tested that lesson across years and across a generation of soldiers, British and American and Afghan, and from the coalition nations that sent their people to the same green zone and the same mud walls and the same arithmetic of a conflict that was always more complicated than the summary of it suggested. The test produced conclusions that are still being processed in the institutions and in the individuals who carry it. The village is quiet, the dust settles in long, slow curtains through the Afita-known light. The dogs that went quiet an hour ago have found their voices again, and 4 men are already somewhere else, carrying nothing with them that they didn't carry before, leaving behind the specific kind of silence that exists only if something has passed through a place and decided for the moment to move on. The mathematics changed. It was always going to change again. That is the only certainty that Helmand has ever offered, and the only one that its history has ever failed to disprove.